just to make sure we all know where we are. It really began around the turn of the century with efforts to reconcile the principles underlying architectural design with rapid technological advancement. It would take the form of new movements, expressive and experimental directions, innovative schools of design, and divergent architectural styles, some in tension with one another and often equally define such classification. Next, the earliest roots of modern architecture can be found in Joseph Paxton's Crystal Palace in London, a cast iron plate glass building that housed the Great Exhibition of 1851, an international showcase for leading examples of the latest technology. Next, an interior view showing the Victorian period and the tremendous contrast between the architecture and the ornamentation. Frank Lloyd Wright's Unity Temple in Chicago next makes use of these new construction materials, respectively iron and concrete. Designed with Wright's familiar overhanging roof and lack of a steeple, the temple avoids a conventional church layout. Pews are set in a U configuration where no one in the congregation is more than 45 feet from the pulpit. Next. To minimize noise, there are no windows at street level, yet light streams into the interior through clear stories along the upper walls. The stained glass panels in the coffered ceiling, the color scheme of greens, yellows, and browns reflect Wright's love of nature, and despite its imposing exterior, the Unity Temple is a warm and welcoming place. Next. The importance of the Bauhaus cannot be overlooked. Founded in 1919 by Walter Gropius and others, it was as significant as a leading voice in early modern architecture styles. The Bauhaus distanced itself from ornamentation and earlier ideas of beauty, opting for rationalization. Form follows function was the architectural battle cry of the 1930s. And although many modern buildings do feature lovely ornamentation, it was the goal of the modernists to shift the focal point of architecture from ornamentation to construction and form. In addition to industrial or institutional architecture, dynamic experiments in modern architecture are found in residential designs of the early 20th century, such as, next, the Schroeder House built in 1924 in Utrecht by Dutch architect Gerrit Rietveld. It was intended, next, to minimize walls in lieu of a more open, spacious experience. The house is a leading example of Distille architecture and is the movement's most successfully realized building. Next, the Villa Muller is an architectural structure designed in 1930 by architect Adolf Loos, born in Brno, Austria-Hungary. The villa, located in Prague, Czech Republic, demonstrates a radical simplification of volume divorced from any sense of ornamentation. Next, interior shots. Frank Lloyd Wright is likely the most well-known modern architect, if not the most well-known general architect of world audiences. His aesthetic drive was the convergence of humanity and construction, next, especially apparent in prairie houses of this period. While many other modernists wanted to shock and were drawn to the extremes as a presentation of their aesthetic, Wright preferred both likability and modernity. Next, interior views of the Roby House. Next, falling water in western Pennsylvania. Next, interior views of the setting, which is magnificent and lovely, helps to be framed and frame nature. Next, and his controversial work, the Guggenheim Museum of Art in Manhattan, where the question of, is the museum the art or is the art the art, becomes interesting. Gaining popularity after the Second World War, architectural modernism was adopted by many influential architects and architectural educators. I can think of a dozen notable architects important to the history and development of the modernist movement, but there's only time to mention a few. In particular, Walter Gropius, V. Spandereau, and Le Corbusier. Gropius emigrated to the United States to practice and teach at Harvard, while Mies settled in Chicago at the Illinois Institute of Technology. Le Corbusier remained in France. The architects' collaborative as a design philosophy grew out of Gropius's thinking at the Bauhaus. The Architects Collaborative reflected Walter Gropius's central preoccupation with social responsibilities of architecture. The idea of collaboration was carried out in that an entire group of architects have their input on a project rather than putting an emphasis on individualism. William Conklin has said that his firm followed the collaborative principles espoused by Walter Gropius in the formation of the Architects Collaborative, being that all design work on a project was begun in group discussions, followed by preliminary design and further discussions and designs. Heroic individualism was not to be the architectural goal. Next, Story Hall, also known as the Gropius Complex, was commissioned at Harvard University as the first modern building on campus. It was also the first major endorsement in the country as a modern style and constituted a turning point in the acceptance of the modernist aesthetic in the United States. The career of Mies van der Rohe was defined by the less is more ideology. He called his work skin and bones architecture, minimal in design and enhancing the feelings of open space and free flow. Next. The Farnsworth House, designed by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe in 1951, located near Plano, Illinois, is one of the most famous examples of modernist domestic architecture and was considered unprecedented in its day. Like many architects of the Bauhaus in the 1930s, Mies fled Nazi regime and settled in Chicago. Next. Where he also designed the plan for IIT, next, and most of the buildings on the Illinois Institute of Technology campus, as well as many well-known buildings, including next, the Seagram Building in New York City. The final spearhead of modernism was Le Corbusier, a Swiss Frenchman who took on the challenge of sprawl and overpopulation in urban Paris. What began with housing blocks designed for Parisian slums turned into entire city plans. Next, the Chapel of Notre Dame de Haut in Ronchamp, completed in 1954, is one of the most important examples of 20th century religious architecture. Next, the Villa Savoye, just outside of Paris, designed by Le Corbusier, is credited as being one of modern architecture's international style transformational buildings for its innovative free floor plan. Next. Thereby allowing walls to be placed freely and only where aesthetically needed. The international style is a major architectural style that emerged in the 20s and 30s, the formative decades of modern architecture. The international style emphasized to a greater degree basic characteristics of modernism, a radical simplification of form, a rejection of ornament, and adoption of glass, steel, and concrete as preferred materials. The term actually originated from the name of a book by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, The International Style, that identified, categorized, and expanded upon characteristics common to modernism across the world and its stylistic aspects. The authors identified three principles: the expression of volume rather than mass, the emphasis of balance rather than preconceived symmetry, and the expulsion of applied ornament. And finally, we come to Brutalist architecture, another style within the modern movement, flourished from the 1950s to the mid-70s. The English architects Allison and Peter Smithson coined the term in 1953 from the French béton brut, or raw concrete, a phrase used by Le Corbusier to describe the poured, board-marked concrete with which he constructed many of his post-World War II buildings. Examples are typically very linear, fortress-like, and blockish. Next. Often with a predominance of concrete construction. Le Corbusier's Unité de Habitation in Marseille, France, built between 1947 and 1952, is an early example of this design direction in architecture. Initially, the style came about for government buildings, low-rent housing, and shopping centers to create functional structures at low cost. But eventually, designers adopted the look for other uses such as college buildings, institutions, corporations, and more. Washington Plaza Baptist Church, Lake Anne, next, follows in that tradition. Next, Marcel Breuer. We have a collage of images, the Whitney Museum in the upper right, the Geothermal House in bottom right, and the American Press Institute on the left-hand side. Paul Rudolph, next. Well known for one single building, the Yale Art and Architecture School in New Haven, Connecticut. Highly complex floor plans, the use of rough-hewn concrete, one of his most spatially complex structures. Next. Louis Kahn's architecture is notable for simple Platonic forms and compositions, while rooted in the international style and yet sympathetic to the massing of forms found in Brutalism. Kahn's architecture was an amalgam of his Beaux-Arts education and a personal aesthetic impulse to develop his own architectural forms. Salk Institute in La Jolla, California, 2 views. Next. Next. The National Parliament Building in Bangladesh. Next. From the other side. And next, the Kimball Art Museum in Fort Worth, Texas. So what do you think? Modern architecture is still alive and it's still with us today. It has become a stronghold of American aesthetics and popular culture. While many buildings have succumbed to demolition in the 70s, many more are being actively protected and revered for their historical impact on art and society. From this brief survey of 20th century architecture, I hope you're able to discover a broader design context of considerable talents of those who contributed to the architecture and design of Reston, Virginia. Thank you very, very much for your patience, and I'm happy to introduce Cheryl Theriault-Sung.